Okay.
Hello, Eric.
Hi.
You got your couch squared away there?
I did, thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, I read you every week, try to catch up as best as I can, and way back when you're still at MSNBC. But I was hoping you could kind of start off here talking about your career a little bit, how you left, you know, MSNBC, and what your role is at Media Matters now.
Sure. You mean my career as a blogger or my career as a human being?
A career as a human being, where I'm interested in the larger truths.
Well, I have two careers that sometimes come together and sometimes don't. On the one hand, I've been started out as a typical sort of aspiring magazine journalist, opinion writer, and then I became...
Did you always want to write for The New Yorker?
I thought I did. I don't anymore. I've written for them a few times, but...
Everybody in my newsroom wants to write.
Yeah, no, I did when I was younger.
Exactly.
But I don't have the right voice for The New Yorker, and I'm at peace with that. Anyway, point is I could never make up my mind between whether or not I wanted to be a journalist or an academic. So I did both at the same time, and I didn't do either one all that well. I went to graduate school twice, got a master's in international relations and then a PhD in American history with a minor in Jewish studies. And at the same time, I worked as a freelance journalist that whole time.
You say you did both poorly, but you seem pretty happy these days.
Well, the thing is I did do both poorly, but I exist in a space in between the two now, where I get to do what I always wanted to do, which is...
So you're winning.
Well, you know, that's one way of putting it. But no, I wouldn't say I'm winning. I'm saying I get to do what I want to do, which is great. You know, I get to make a decent living doing what I want to do, which is trying to bring, you know, in my own modest way, academic rigor and sort of ideas and the sort of demand for documentation and solidity to the world of public discourse and debate, far beyond, you know, the ivory tower. And it doesn't always work.
So you're having fun with what you're doing, you feel like you're contributing, and you're making a living at it.
Yeah, no, I have no complaints about the living I make, but I do have 7 jobs, or I have five, depending on how you define them. I have 5 gigs, and I'm writing 2 books simultaneously, so that's 7 different things I'm always supposed to be doing. And right now I have no staff at all.
Now, when you were, what was the relationship with MSNBC? Were they paying you to be a blogger there?
Damn straight.
Awesome.
I believe that history will record that I was the very first person to be asked by a news organization to begin a blog.
They actually asked you to begin with. You didn't have one already. They said, "Could you start one?"
Would you please do a blog for MSNBC, and we will pay you. That was.
I did not know that.
And that blog began in May 2002. Now, of course, I wasn't the first blogger by any stretch. Mickey had one, Andy had one, Josh had one. But they were, Mickey may have already been at Slate by that point. But he did it, like, they were braver than I was. They started out on this thing that nobody really knew if it had a future and just did it. Whereas I needed these people to say, we're going to pay you X amount to do it. And I already saw how it was done from the way it was being done by that. So I did that very happily. I thought it was a great thing to get paid to do. And MSNBC was wonderful. They never interfered in any way. They never told me how many hits I got. They never asked me to write about anything. They never asked me really not to write about anything.
They just cut you a check, huh?
Yeah, and they edited me, and they put me up on MSNBC. They did all the work. So when that came to an end, I was hired by MSNBC when MSNBC, the station, first went on the air. I was one of those people they hired to talk about stuff.
Talking heads.
Yeah, and I also was given a column on the website, which, well, I certainly wasn't the first person to have a column on a website, but it was one of the first sort of efforts to create an online commentary. Me and John Fund and I think Laura Ingram and Rick Stengel and some other people were hired to do that then by Merrill Brown, who was the head of MSNBC. And I managed to stick around at MSNBC, to my own surprise, for 10 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah, from the first day it was on the air, which was, if my memory serves, July 15th, 1996.
96.
Yeah, till the end of last summer, in September of 2006, when they decided to discontinue my blog, for pretty good reasons, I thought. And
which were what?
Huh?
Which were what, if you want to share them?
Well, as I understand them, it was when I was hired. As I said, I was the first blog, and by the time they said, "Okay, that was great," there were millions and millions of blogs on MSNBC, and all of them supported some other MSNBC operation, like either.
So you're kind of a loose appendage then.
Yeah, they were just paying me to have a good time on my blog, whereas everything else either supported an MSNBC program on the cable station or was done by somebody who worked there as kind of an appendage to their job. Whereas it's not like I was driving a ton of traffic to them, because
right.
My numbers, I later found out I didn't have to ask. Like I said, I never knew my numbers, and I was pleased not to know them. But eventually I asked when I needed to move the blog, and it didn't depress me, but it's not like I was. MSNBC had 13 million visitors a day during the day, and another 11 million at night. I wasn't a very important factor in that. So they were just paying me, as sort of a vanity purchase, and they decided they didn't need it after a while. And fortunately, I was able to, with one phone call up David Brock and say, I have this institution that I've created called Altercation.
Yes.
I really enjoy it. I don't want to change anything. Will you pay me to do it for you instead of them? And he said, now I will pay you. I give you a 20% raise. So it turned out to be a good thing from that standpoint that I got cut loose at MSNBC. Because I get paid more money now to do the same thing. And it's a slightly different kind of blog now, because at MSNBC I had a lot of people who got there by accident through MSNBC. And now it's much more of a self-selecting.
So a little bit more of a narrow cross-section.
I think so. I mean, again, I don't see the numbers now either, so I'm not sure.
But you can tell it from your inbox.
Yeah, although I also don't see my inbox.
Oh, okay.
I do that on purpose. I get a lot of nasty email. I generate strong feelings on people, and I don't really feel I need that in my life. Like, people don't.
What a healthy decision.
So I pay someone to clean it out for me and send me the stuff that I might like to print.
Fair enough. Now, the mission over at Media Matters, it's progressive research and information center correcting conservative misinformation in the U.S. media. And I kind of want to talk about kind of what your definitions of liberal and conservative are in relation to two articles. Cohen's article from the Washington Post about Bush being a neoliberal, and your review of liberalism for a new century.
Yeah.
In that liberalism for a new century review, you talk about Peter Berkowitz and his contribution to the book, and you wonder why he's in there as a liberal. And as a side note, you say liberalism is a broad definition, could be applied to many people, including Reagan and Thatcher, but not George W. Bush. So, in light of Richard Cohen's case that Bush is a neoliberal, could you kind of explain why Reagan and Thatcher could be painted with that term, but never, ever, ever W?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to get into Richard Cohen's column, because I think it was just silly. I think he was just trying to be cute, and he misused some terms, didn't really understand the meaning of the word neoliberal, and like I said, I don't think he gave that a lot of thought, and I wouldn't put too much faith in that.
Okay, well, if I could touch on it then, we can go over it. No,
I'm happy to talk about definitions of liberalism.
Okay,
I just don't think Richard Cohen sheds any light on it. And I think that if you sat Richard Cohen down, we're friendly, Richard Cohen and I. We used to be, I'd say, better friends than we are now. It's not like we end up falling out. We just don't see each other much. But I think if I sat him down, I could talk about it. I think he would admit that was just an ill.
Well, I'll play Richard Cohen, and you talk me out of it.
Yeah, but I don't remember the column well enough to do that.
Well, I have it in front of me, so it's good times for everyone.
Sure. You play Richard Cohen.
I will. He says, Bush has extended the Department's education's reach in a manner no Democrat could have ever envisaged. He talks about diversity in the secretary level with Condi Rice and Alberto Gonzalez. And he talks about, of course, Bush's immigration reform. And then finally, the point I'm sure you'll love the most is that there were liberal intentions behind his invasion of Iraq. And he basically makes the case, George Will would, is that it's a very Wilsonian war with liberal intentions, democratization, and the rest of it. So, starting with education, immigration, and Iraq, why is he wrong that those are all liberal enterprises?
Well, Richard Cohen is associating liberalism with just the reach of the government into people's lives.
So just the size of government and all small versus big.
That's a silly definition. There's nothing about liberalism that says you have to have a big government or that you have to have a Department of Education. The point...
But 99% of liberals would definitely support the Department of Education.
Well, they wouldn't support it to do the things that George Bush does with it. No, I'm serious.
That's
government
true.
is a neutral value. The question is, what are you using government for? Now, beginning around the New Deal, liberalism became associated with the expansion of government because the government was used to give meaning to liberal values. In other words, the reason that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are liberals, by the classical definition, is because they believe in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment accords to individuals certain rights. But by the 1920s, those rights had ceased to have much pragmatic meaning because the individuals were so powerless vis-a-vis the larger forces, mainly corporations and trusts and monopolies and so forth. So liberals decided that they needed that in order to offset those powers, they needed the power of government to strengthen individuals' ability to realize the values of the Enlightenment. Now, if George W. Bush is using those same institutions in opposition to the values of the Enlightenment, or in opposition to the...
So in what sense is he not? I mean, as inept as George Bush is, I mean, don't we think No Child Left Behind, the intention at least, was to empower individuals in the classical liberal sense? I'm not an expert on No Child Left Behind. My daughter goes to public school in New York City, in a school which is opted out from the guidelines of No Child Left Behind. And every school in New York City that can opt out does, because the guidelines are so rigid that it doesn't allow for any of the... It makes it very difficult for any of the things that liberals believe in education, school, creativity, finding your own way to things. It's all about test scores. It's all about regimentation. It's all about teaching for the test. So I think that the values that George Bush has embraced in his version of No Child Left Behind are not even conservative. They're just right-wing reactionary values. Okay, well, maybe we make more ground there. What you said you're not conservative, maybe right-wing reactionary. What's your definition of conservatism as opposed to right-wing reactionism?
Conservatism is simple. It seeks to conserve, But George Bush doesn't seek to conserve. George Bush seeks to overthrow. George Bush seeks to overthrow the protections of the American Constitution. He seeks to overthrow the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world. He seeks to overthrow, institutions in other countries that have hundreds and hundreds of years of roots in those countries. He has no respect for traditional relationships between groups. He doesn't even respect science. He doesn't respect the normative science and the ability of the government to set sort of norms based on traditional methods of testing and intellectual inquiry. So I think he's a radical revolutionary. And I think
George Will would definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, well, George Will can't be wrong about everything. So, and to get back to this original idea of liberalism, George Bush does not believe in the Enlightenment. George Bush has more in common ideologically with Marxist ideologues and fascist ideologues and ideologues like Osama bin Laden who say, I know the truth. I know the truth. The truth comes to me directly from my faith. In the case of,
And so in what ways were Reagan and Thatcher better? What specific policies or initiatives that Reagan and Thatcher pursued?
Were capitalists, but they believed in that truth could be demonstrated in such a way that we could all find it together. They said if you do an experiment and the experiment comes out X, then X is true. Whereas Bush would say, if you...
I missed that Reagan speech. I'm looking for some concrete examples, whether it's, Reagan's famous address at the 64 convention or, tear down this wall.
Yeah, well, Reagan's position about capitalism versus communism was that capitalism was a superior system and it would defeat communism normatively, which it did, which was true. He wasn't saying God is on my side and therefore we will win. He was saying we'll defeat you because we're better at producing things.
On the other hand, he did definitely embrace a lot of religious rhetoric behind, in favor of the West, as opposed.
I have nothing against religious rhetoric. I speak in religious rhetoric myself sometimes. I'm a big fan of Martin Luther King. Religious rhetoric is fine, but it's the idea of privileging one's faith over one's reason. That's the essential divide between the Enlightenment and pre-modern. Pre-Enlightenment societies.
And Reagan satisfied you on the putting reason before faith
Reagan
barometer?
staffed the government with competent people. He did. Whereas Bush...
So competence is a key issue as far as being able to be
competence, technological expertise. I mean, the Bush administration put a 24-year-old kid in at NASA and instructed him, and he instructed James Hansen on what he was allowed to say to the press. 24-year-old kid who was a college dropout. And the same kid, before he was later found out, told the scientists that they were not to refer to evolution as anything but a theory. Or the Big Bang. He's talking about the Big Bang. As anything but a theory. Because it conflicted with people's religions. Okay? Now, I'm all for religion, but religion has no place in scientific policy of a government, okay? But Bush would say it did. Bush would say it's just as important. Bush would say fine, So Bush's his policies in the war, it's not just incompetence, it's that he's a religious fanatic. And he says, look, everyone believes in freedom, and that's why we've got to stay in Iraq forever, to give these people the opportunity to be free. But his definition of freedom has nothing whatsoever to do with the definition of freedom that people understand in that part of the world. And he's trying to impose it on them, the same way the Christian Crusades tried to impose their definition of freedom on Islam, centuries ago, on the infidels. So, there's a fundamental divide between people like Reagan and Thatcher and Milton Friedman who say capitalism is the superior world system, and I can demonstrate that. And Bush is saying, I don't have to demonstrate it. I know it because God talks to me and I'm at one with my God. That's the same damn thing that Osama bin Laden says. So it's got a different idea of what God's telling you.
So speaking of different, definitions of freedom, Berkowitz in his recent Wall Street Journal article talks about conservatism meaning preserving individual liberty. Definitely taking along the much, the same route as when you talked about Reagan and Thatcher as classic liberals.
Yeah.
Do you see this as what most conservatives, or what the conservative movement means today, or do you think that conservatism means something entirely different from preserving individual liberty?
Well, I don't think anyone can defend conservative actions on the basis of conservative ideology today. I mean, if you take George Bush was elected as a conservative, and all the people in the Republican Congress were elected as conservatives, people who ran, and they call themselves conservatives. And yet, they vastly increased the size of government. They vastly increased the deficit. They undertook an incredibly unconservative and catastrophic adventure in the Middle East. Everything that one would say about conservatism. They intervened in the lives of families. Government was instructing people what they could and couldn't do with regard to the Schiavo case. I mean, the very way that this that Bush became president was incredibly unconservative. The Supreme Court overturned the decision of the Florida State Court in opposition to everything that the doctrinally that the Supreme Court had been saying up to that point. Bush v. Gore is an incredibly unconservative decision, which is why when they announced it, they said, by the way, this isn't a precedent for anything, because they knew they were just doing the necessary thing to get their guy in power.
Have you paid attention to any of the strains on the right, especially now that immigration is going on, as far as tension with Bush's big government conservatism?
Well, here's the thing. I don't think that Bush is a conservative.
Well, I know, but there's a lot of people under his party, the GOP, that thinks they're conservatives and are very unhappy with what is going on under his presidency.
Let's first define what conservative means if, in fact, Bush is a conservative. It means expansion of the government.
Well, I mean, we can talk about Bush you want, but he's only going to be with us for,
okay, fine. We'll talk about what you want to talk about. It's your agenda. I just, to me, what a conservative means is...
Outside of Bush.
What conservative philosophy means, going back to, say, Russell Kirk and people like that, is it means a limited role for the government in the lives of individuals. And it means a connection, an organic connection with the past. Now, I'm a conservative in many ways because I think that things are the way they are for good reasons. And you can't just go around saying, I wish they were different, and therefore I'm going to change them.
Because that does sound very conservative.
Yeah, and so a lot of the things that liberals tried to do in the 1960s and 1970s were catastrophic because they felt like, oh, I have good intentions. I'm against racism. I'm against sexism. I'm against, I want all little black, brown, and Oriental kids to
You're making them sound an awful lot like George W. Bush.
Well, the difference is that I'm consistent and have well, there are lots of differences. You can say I sound like George Bush. I don't think I sound.
No, I didn't say you were sounding. I'm saying the liberals back then sound like your portrayal of them sound like George W. Bush.
The arrogance of power was similar in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. That's absolutely true. And liberals, I think, I've just written a book which will be out early next year called Why We're Liberals. The subheading is a political guidebook to post-Bush America. I like that phrase, post-Bush America, because it puts everybody in a good mood.
It's almost here.
Yeah. And my argument is that liberalism has learned an awful lot of painful lessons in the past 20 years, and is a much, much more realistic and moderate creed than it was
20 years.
20 years
ago.
And it's continually
you're dating Reagan as the beginning of the lesson learning?
The lesson learning, it should have started as early as 1965, 66. That's when liberalism started to go off the rails. But it took a lot longer.
And how did it go off the rails? What's your critique of liberalism going off the rails?
The best book on that topic is Tom and Mary Edsel's book called Chain Reaction, where what liberals did was they raised everybody's taxes, and they instructed the people whose taxes they were raising that they knew best what those people needed in their lives, and what they needed was to have all of these liberal ideals and foisted upon them without them having any say in how it would be done.
Wow, Eric, you sound like Rush Limbaugh here.
Well, just because Rush Limbaugh says something doesn't make it wrong. It turns out that most of what he says is wrong. But here's the thing: liberalism, by having so much difficulty facing up to its flaws in the 60s and 70s, has opened up the door for loudmouth demagogues like Rush Limbaugh, like George Bush, like all these people who exploit liberalism's weaknesses. And I'm saying, thank goodness, after 30 years, or even more, of failing to understand what was at work, what gave these right-wing blowhards, not conservatives, but right-wing blowhards their opening, I'm saying liberals have finally learned. And that
so if the Great Society lock the experts in a room, when they come out with a solution, go with it, raise everyone's taxes, if that's not liberalism, what is Eric Alterman liberalism?
Well, right now, liberalism has grown so cautious and conservative in many ways. That what most people, what most Americans want from their government is what liberalism is for the time being. I mean, the thing about liberalism is very, very difficult to define. I spent about 10 pages in the book defining it, and it's still kind of murky.
Wait, so your definition of liberalism is what people want from their government?
No, I'm just saying that there is a consistent overlap now between what Americans say in terms of health care and environmental protection and defense for people's economic well-being and sensible foreign policy. In other words, what's happened over the past 30 years is that liberalism has moved rightward, and the country has actually moved slightly leftward, while the government and the Republican Party have moved way rightward. So that there is a very large, if you look at the Venn diagram, between liberalism and the majority of Americans, there's an enormous overlap on those two things. Now, there's people to the left of liberalism who are outside of that consensus. And to be honest, liberals still have a few problems in reaching the country. Most of them having to do with two issues, national security and, I would say, abortion. And once you get past those two issues, the country is basically a liberal country right now, in part because the people who call themselves conservatives
defined as what? I mean, getting out of Iraq and universal health care, is that your definition? I mean, when you say the country is now more left, what does that mean?
Issue after issue. If you ask people, A, universal health care, B, until recently, minimum wage, trade policy, environmental policy, science policy, foreign policy, the people who we call liberals, their views are broadly endorsed by 60 to 70% of the country. On most issues.
I mean, I could hire Frank Luntz to have a poll that would word
Frank Luntz will get
properly.
But if you look carefully, and I do in the book, if you analyze the recent Pew report of people in the press, and you also look at it over time, you'll see that what I'm saying, I'm not making it up, that the numbers are there to support it. And in the other book I would recommend, the two most important analytical books I've read about American politics, one is the one I just mentioned by Tom and Marisol. The other one is a book that came out a couple of years ago called Off Center by two political scientists. And they analyze, again, the same data that I use, although a lot of my analysis rests on theirs, and they demonstrate that whereas the Republican Party its center of gravity has moved way right, the public center of gravity has moved somewhat left. And the reason it doesn't look that way is because the entire South has moved into the Republican side, and that's changed the electoral makeup of the country. It made it much harder for Democrats to get elected.
We're speaking of lots of generalities here. If we could just kind of go specific. I mean, you talk about all these polls showing the country moving left, etc. And, I keep thinking, coming back to the immigration debate today that's going on. New York Times came out with a poll this week showing, a vast majority of Americans are in favor of the immigration bill because they want to, because they don't want to deport they don't want to deport the immigrants that are here, but they want to provide them a path to citizenship. And that's the way the New York Times phrased it. Ran into a poll, boom, majority of Americans are in favor of the bill.
Yeah, I don't see immigration as a left-right issue.
Oh, okay.
The Wall Street Journal
what do you see there?
Page, the most right-wing voice imaginable in any sensible discourse.
Well, what about our National Review friends? What are they? Chopped liver?
The Wall Street Journal editorial page, they love unrestricted immigration because they want cheap labor. And the labor movement is very anti-immigration, much of it, it's not all of it, because those workers are the workers whose jobs are being, whose wages are being undermined.
I got a dissent from you here. I'm trapped in my blog world, as I like to say. But, uniformly, conservative blogs I read are all against it, and they're all up in arms against the Wall Street Journal. National Review is, repeatedly challenging to a debate in quite stark terms.
Yeah, well, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is much more important and influential than National Review. National Review is rather insignificant compared to the Wall Street Journal, in my opinion.
We can come back to that. I mean, what about Rush Limbaugh, luring him? Well, all the talk radio bigwigs are all against this immigration bill.
Those people are nativists.
Okay,
and they're in many cases, particularly Limbaugh, they're appealing to racism.
my point is that everyone, 99% of the people you would label as conservatives, whether or not they work for the Wall Street Journal or not, are against this immigration bill, especially the ones I read. When you go to the places the normal to the left, the people at Taft,
well, wait a minute.
John
McCain is a conservative. He's for it. And George Bush is most people's definition of a conservative, and he's for it.
And there's a reason why people on the right are calling for his impeachment now.
No, there are an awful lot of conservatives who are pro-immigration, and there are an awful lot of liberals who think we should have much better enforcement, including myself. I don't support illegal immigration.
That's true. I was eventually going to get to that, but
so I just don't think. Look, I agree that there are very strong forces in the Republican Party, probably the majority of them, that if you polled Republican primary voters, how many of them do you think would be in favor of this immigration bill? I'm sure that most of them don't know what's in it. Number one.
Okay. How many of them do you think would be for an enforcement first position?
Look, I'd just be guessing. So I don't
ballpark it 90, 80, 10, 30.
No, I don't dispute the fact that there is a very strong nativist sentiment inside the Republican Party, and that those people don't like.
And none of those nativists are concerned about border enforcement like you are. They're all just nativists.
I have no idea what. This is why. You see, you want me to tell you what people are thinking when I don't know what they're thinking. I'm saying.
Well, I'm just asking if it's a possibility that there's large swaths of the GOP base that share your view on immigration and that aren't nativists.
Of course there are.
Okay.
But if you look at the history of the people you were talking about earlier, like Limbaugh, like the entire talk radio spectrum and much of the cable TV spectrum, and for instance Lou Dobbs, those people are driven. Based on my understanding of everything I've read of theirs and seen of theirs over the past 10 or 20 years, by nativism, and to a considerable degree by racism. And those are the people that are making most of the noise. Now, I don't really care that much about immigration, to tell you the truth. I'm not, Mickey Kaus can't talk about anything else. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who think it's the most important thing in the world. I just think my whole position on immigration is that our system is broken, and it would be nice if we could fix it. And I would also like to see the weakest link in the system, which are the illegal immigrants, to stop being the people who are most exploited. They're exploited on the other side of the border, and they're exploited when they get here. And those people should be given legal protection. And if they're not, and if they can't be given legal protection, we shouldn't let them in, because just to allow them to just be taken advantage of by coyotes on one side and by unscrupulous employers on this side is a lose-lose situation for everyone. So I think we've got a terrible system, just like I think we had a terrible welfare system, and that needed to be fixed. Now, most people who wanted to reform welfare were also conservatives, and a lot of them were racist, and a lot of them weren't. But I don't think that because you support or don't support legal legal immigration, it makes you necessarily a liberal or a conservative. It's true that, look.
Well, no one issue makes you a liberal or conservative, but it is a data point.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's a good one. I mean, if you've got the union movement on one side and the Wall Street Journal editorial page and big business, it's not just the journal itself. They're not, it's just that they're speaking for the position of big business. They're speaking for all these corporations that and industries like the restaurant industry and
small businesses
and the home care industry that make their profits on the backs of these exploited illegals. If you've got that, you don't have a very neat cut anymore, right?
But
if big business is on what you would say is the left of this issue, and big labor is on what you would say is the right of this issue, then it's not a very clear-cut left-right issue.
Well, I think when you look at businesses behind it, but business is also for the Medicare bill. Big business can get behind certain issues, but I think when you have such a large swath of the GOP base seething in anger against it, it's a pretty strong determinant about whether or not it is a conservative issue. I will grant you that I don't see hardly any talk about it on the left. When I do see more of a lot more what you're talking about, not on the enforcement side, but as far as these people are getting exploited. We need to, provide a path to legalization for these people. A lot of talk about being against the guest worker programs because they never worked in Europe. They're not going to work here. Along those issues, they have their own. There's also some environmental concerns.
Yeah.
But there's hardly. I don't see anyone. Not anyone. I see very few people on the left taking more enforcement first. We need to build a fence position.
Well, the reason I support the fence, and I'm not sure I support the fence. I only support the fence with the caveat that it would work, and I'm not sure it would work. I have actually spent some time out there. I traveled for a week in a car with the INS. I drove around chasing these people.
I did read that.
Yeah, so I do have
what did you
a
learn?
tiny little bit of credibility on this point. But I'm actually skeptical that a fence would work. But my point is
and many conservatives are too.
Yeah, but my point is that any enforceable regime is better than what we have now. Because what we have now encourages people to break the law, and it encourages people to exploit other people, and exploit the weakest people. We don't have a problem with too many illegal doctors in this country. We don't have a problem with too many illegal lawyers in this country. We only have a problem with unskilled labor, because that's what big business wants. And the doctors and the lawyers are able to protect themselves.
Well, big business would love a bunch of cheap laborers, a cheap lawyer in law hours, but they have to contend with state bar associations.
No, but that's what I'm saying. The powerful and the wealthy people have been able to protect themselves from the threat to their standard of living from immigration. But the powerless people, unskilled laborers, have not. And that suits the big business and these corporations just fine. And that's the main reason we have this situation.
So do you see anybody on the Democratic side of the White House 08 race picking up immigration as an issue? I've seen a little bit more of the MyDD and Daily Cost diaries that I read, snippets that candidates in Iowa, not in New Hampshire, but in other states, are getting asked questions about immigration on the trail. Do you think it would be an issue at all on the Democratic side?
I don't think it's an issue for the nomination. I agree with you that it's a potentially explosive issue in the general election. But I don't think it's the kind of issue where a Democrat's going to have to define him or herself now. I think that there's going to be I think this is not what Democrats care about right now, particularly. As long as you speak in compassionate terms about the victims, you don't have to actually say what you support or what you don't support. No one's going to demand it.
Very true.
And then when the general election comes, you'll have some wiggle room, which is unusual for Democrats. Democrats they're much more pragmatic about politics than there used to be.
So now that we're on 08, I wanted to press you, see if I could get a Eric Alterman, not necessarily an endorsement, but if you had to vote today in a New York primary, who would you vote for?
That's a very hard thing for me to answer.
Ruminate.
Well, I would vote for Al Gore today.
All right, huh?
I like. I kind of love Obama, but here's the problem.
What are your Obama doubts? Because everyone's got some.
Here are my Obama doubts. They have nothing to do with Obama. My understanding of the way elections work right now is that 99% of the vote has already been determined, or 97% of the vote has already been determined. And what matters are a few heavily populated cities and suburbs and exurbs in about 5 to 7 states. And the people that matter in those places...
And we're talking general or primary now?
General.
Okay, good.
You see, because I think all 3 of these people would be excellent presidents, so I'd be happy with any of them. Obama has a few... they all have strengths and weaknesses. I could make the case for any one of them. But the people who determine those votes, the people who are going to determine the election, are basically white ethnic males in those places. Those are the swing voters in Ohio and Florida and, to a lesser degree, New Mexico and Pennsylvania.
So is this an undecided argument or a turnout argument?
What?
Is this an undecided argument or a turnout argument? Do you think Obama is going to turn these people off, keep them away from the polls?
I think that's where racism lives. you know, I think that white ethnic males are the people who are most threatened by the ascendance of women, most threatened by the ascendance
is that you and me?
Of minorities.
Since you're Jewish and I'm Irish?
I guess. Yeah,
we're the problem.
Our peeps, our posse. Jews
Why can't
don't
you be part
actually
of
qualify as ethnic.
Why can't you be part of the solution, Eric? Why do you have to be part of the problem?
Jews vote like Puerto Ricans, right?
Okay, so it's just my
Just
fault.
you. And those people, I think, those are the people that went for George Bush's tough talk in 2004, and they gave him his margin, such as it was. And you can't poll this kind of thing. People don't admit that they're not going to vote for the black guy. So it's an incredible risk to nominate Obama, to decide that the country is, with one senator and a few, are there any black governors now?
Not that I know of.
No, so no governors, one senator, one.
But you don't have the same fear about a white woman.
I have a very similar fear about a white woman, in addition to the fact that she's Hillary Clinton, which I think she's maxed out on her popularity. So they're both incredibly risky nominees, and I'm very nervous about both of them. And they both have strengths, and I think they both actually be excellent in
What if Clinton shored up her white male ethnic problem with a Jim Webb underneath her?
You can't do it with a vice president. Vice presidents don't matter. The only thing vice presidents matter for is that they don't lose the debate. That's the only thing they're good for. They don't lose that debate. And both times, Edwards probably tied Cheney, and Lieberman lost to Cheney, so those were bad choices, turns out.
So I guess you're making a roundabout argument for Edwards then, kind of.
From a purely electability standpoint, Edwards is the safest bet. Yes, I am saying that. And he also turns out to be the most progressive of the three. So I'd be perfectly happy with Edwards. I think he'd be a great presidential candidate, and the Democrats probably win with him.
Are you at all worried about the haircut stories and the speaking piece stories? Now, I know you're probably not a fan of these stories, but in the hotline here, we all have very political lives and friends, but we always kind of take note of what our relatives and friends who know nothing at all about politics are paying attention to. And we've all been kind of struck that, for whatever reason, the stories that stick to Edwards the most, when people think Edwards, do they think of the haircut guy? Does that worry you at all?
Well, it worries me about the stupidity and cupidity of the mainstream media. Yeah. That story is just idiotic.
Well, you go into elections with the mainstream media. You got.
No, I agree. You're absolutely right, and it does worry me. Yeah, there's an intense effort on the part of conservatives to feminize Edwards,
and it's working.
And it's working, and he needs to deal with it. And it's a sad and pathetic commentary on our politics. But you're absolutely right, and it seems to be sticking, and I don't exactly know how to solve it. So it's a problem.
So are you rescinding your Edwards endorsement then?
No, I don't think it's as big a problem as being black or being Hillary Clinton.
Okay.
But it still makes me yearn even more for Al Gore, I'll say that.
Okay. So Al Gore is the first choice, and just so we also get this on the record, you do or do not think he's going to run?
I feel very strongly that he's not going to run.
Yeah, I'm there too.
And I'm very sorry about that, because I think rarely in, my degree is in history. Rarely in history have a moment and a human being been so well matched as Al Gore it would be to the American presidency right now. And it's a damn shame that he doesn't want it badly enough.
And that's the issue, he doesn't want it badly enough.
Yeah, I talked to him a bunch about this. Not a bunch, not like we're friends, but I do see him every few months at events. And I used to hassle him personally, on behalf of my country. And now I don't even do that anymore because he's just not interested. He's not there.
And yet I read that you fear Fred Thompson will win.
I think Fred Thompson's a terrific candidate for the Republicans. I feel like he's already won the nomination,
Really?
Yeah, he's just perfect. He just solves all their problems. And the media loves him. And he's going to be a very formidable candidate if he wins. And it's impossible to know because there's so many unknowable factors and so many things could change. But he's the only guy in the Republican field who appeals to every faction and has nothing that would disqualify him to any important group of people. So I think he's, I really want to look into those places where you bet on people, because I would bet a lot of money on Fred Thompson.
In trade it's called.
Okay.
Cool. Well, we are right at the 45-minute mark, so I say we call it a day, Eric.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Hey, it was great talking to you.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Take care.